Good afternoon. I'm Mark Fitzgerald. I'm a partner at KPMG, and today I'm joined by my colleague and fellow partner, Arun, Ghosh. Just wanted to set the scene. We're going to talk about sustainability, and we're particularly going to focus on innovation in the area of sustainability. And Arun has the role within the firm. He leads our blockchain service for the entirety of the Americas. And is closely associated with what we call KPMG Impact, which focuses on ESG services in the US. So, Arun, let's dive straight in. Let's level set. I use the term sustainability. Why do we care as a firm, or even go even more simplistic? What does sustainability mean to us? How do we define it? And also, why do we care as a firm?
I think it's not a question of why. I think the question of why shouldn't we, right? So not to answer a question of the question, but more importantly, as the world has woken up post-pandemic, there's a sense of purpose and urgency, right? And even pre-pandemic, there's a lot of innovation going around the topics of renewable energy, supply, demand, regulation. But just the pandemic just brought it all to the surface. From a KPMG standpoint, or KPMG Impact, thank you for mentioning that, is our global umbrella getting everybody together. We're a large audit, tax, and advisory organization with multiple jurisdictions. Mark, you work in the Washington area in a very structured business the same way, for KPMG Impact and all things E, S, and G. Our role, we see ourselves as the G over ESG. So as being a regulated business ourselves, working with Washington regulators as well as state and private auditors, we find ourselves in a unique position where not only can we bring in and be inclusive of regulation, but also make sure there's the impact, and hence KPMG Impact.
Great. So I like the way you phrase it. Why shouldn't we care? Mm-hmm. But I want to unpack that a little bit. So sure. You mentioned and alluded to the size of the firm, and we got 240,000 of our own people in multiple locations and countries. We have our clients, and there's tens of thousands of them. And then there are other stakeholders like regulators, like you mentioned. Do we have a position for each one of those kind of areas of focus? Or do we look at it more holistically? How should we be organizing ourselves as a firm?
So I think we've done an excellent job working with industry partners like the World Economic Forum, the UNFCCC, the International Sustainability Standards Board, and not to go across too many acronyms here, but defining those in the structure of E for all things climate and the environmental issues, all things S, which is not just the socioeconomic impact, but also sustainable corporate development, corporate social responsibility, and then the G, which is where we find ourselves not only imbibing some of the regulations, but also providing transparency. And our brand lends itself to trust. So trusted data, trusted process, and trusted outcome. So that's how we've thought about structuring ES and G. But more importantly, we have great leaders in all jurisdictions and countries that are working across each one of them, but also tying the horizontal, if that makes sense.
Great. So I want to pivot now, taking that premise into innovation in this space. But before we give some thoughts around what we're working on, what the solutions could or should be, can you help us define what is the need for innovation? What is our problem statement today? And then we can kind of figure out what are we going to do about it.
That's a loaded question. How much time do we have? I think innovation had happened or has happened at a pace that we didn't recognize, right? Look at, again, my favorite example is mobile phones in Africa. They didn't wait for landlines. They just leapfrogged into the mobile world. And what we're finding today is whether it's fintech, whether it's big tech, well, big tech is innovating like no tomorrow. But even nonprofits, right? Even where we've found innovation from Brazil to India to Indonesia, where the microcosm of need and necessity has driven an outcome-based sort of focus, right? So for us, picking up on those signals is very important as a firm, but also tying it all together into an ecosystem where we're a participant in the ecosystem as KPMG, but also bringing government, bringing private sector participants, bringing this is a Microsoft sponsored event, so bringing people like Microsoft into the fold is extremely important. And lastly, what I will say is, we heard Vince previous talk about crypto and legislation. The world of crypto began because of the financial crisis in 2008, right? There was a need to innovate in a very quick way, something that was transparent and trusted. And now 10 years later, 12 years later, Bitcoin's 12 years old, believe it or not. We see cryptoverse and carbonverse emerging, and that in itself is becoming a whole other set of innovative ideas brought to life using tech.
So do you see innovation as an enabler, or is it a driver of change in relation to sustainability?
I think it's a disruptor in more ways than one, because it's not the Uberization of ESG, it's making things more powerful and punchy and insightful. Think of activist investors who are going after with a fine-tuned comb, going after every sustainable development goal that organizations have set, looking at their public report that's coming out voluntarily so far, but in Europe, and most regulation in Europe is extremely well coordinated and well audited. So if you look at Europe and you bring it back to the US in terms of how regulation is going to shape transparency and trust, I keep coming back to those two words because that's extremely important. But the it's no longer innovator's dilemma, it's the corporate dilemma for not absorbing and understanding innovation. It's become the other way, right? And so from imbibing and understanding what that means and incorporating that into the corporate structure is that's what's disrupting everything, right? The level of transparency, and this is public knowledge, and I'll mention it again, a fantastic example of how Engine One, a little hedge fund that nobody had heard of, replaced 3 board seats at ExxonMobil because there's just growing impatience between stockholders and stakeholders. How do you tie and connect those things? It's innovation, right? You can argue that as a hedge fund, there's no business innovating because you're hedging, but it's driving that level of what I call momentum capital that government is waking up to, private organizations are waking up to, and innovators are waking up to.
So let's take up on that theme on the last point. There was a conversation earlier today about value and how you define value in this space. What does it mean to a corporate or even a public sector entity or even an individual? So how do you equate value with the area of sustainability? And how do you see innovations playing a role of linking those dots and creating that kind of sense of credibility?
There's many parts to that, and I'm going to try and answer all of them. I think the first thing I would outline is outcome, right? So this is the stakeholder integration of outcome. There is growing sense of impatience in saying there's not enough happening in Washington. We heard the last speakers talk about some of that. So whether it's activist investors or corporations themselves are saying, we're just going to tell the world what we're doing. And then either it's a transparency issue that could become a risk, or the sort of bringing inbound that risk to say, not only are we going to enable ourselves, we're going to, again, remember the ecosystem, we're going to enable everybody. So you're familiar with, especially this is a favorite topic of mine, the emissions, the world of emissions has evolved for us. Scope 1, Scope 2, Scope 3, right? Scope 1's, and for those of you watching and hearing, Scope 1's our individual, to a point about my individual carbon footprint. The Scope 2 is the environment around me that I impact. And Scope 3 is the ecosystem outside of Scope 1 and Scope 2, so the supply chain, if you will. And it couldn't be more funnier. Again, I'm full of examples today. I will not mention the company's name, but it's a prepackaged fruit that you can pick up. For whatever reason, my 16-year-old loves them. And so I was out getting her, and she was going into a tournament. She's like, "Can I get a little packaged fruit?" And as I picked it up, the label actually said, "Made from pears grown in South America, packaged in Hawaii." And I'm here in Boston, picking up that package. So can you imagine the carbon footprint on that? Like cultivating pears in Colombia, Venezuela, where it is, shipping it off to Hawaii because of whatever cost arbitrage or labor arbitrage, or some sort of tax incentive, and then shipping it all the way to Boston for me to buy. So as an individual, I'm horrified, right? Like, what is going on here, right? And the same thing, both, and the big lesson for most organizations and governments has been supply chain resiliency after COVID, right? Hopefully we're all endemic now, right? As the endemic brings us all back together, like today, thankfully, very wonderful to be here. That level of individual responsibility is bubbling its way to corporate responsibility, is bubbling its way to government responsibility. So I think policymakers are taking notice, but not quick enough. All of the above.
So let's take each one of those layers, so I could, because you can come at this from multiple angles. So
Sure.
if you're a regulator, or you're in politics, or
Right.
Whether you're corporate, and even in corporate, you've got different sectors who have different agendas. And then you have individuals supporting both. So if we take the example in the middle, a typical vanilla corporate multinational who have those supply chain considerations pre and post pandemic. But they've also had their executive leadership give an announcement, an ambition. They're going to be decarbonized by this date, or net zero by this date. What's the reality behind that? Is that something that is truly meant, and there's just a need to figure out how we're going to get there after the announcement is made? Or is there true intent working concurrently with those pronouncements? Is that creating value? Is it done for reputational purposes, or is it a business need?
A lot to unpack there. I'd say, first and foremost, it's a split at the board level. It's a board level driven agenda to be socially responsible. Again, the stakeholder dilemma. And then the other half of boards are just doing it for investor valuation, right? Saying, oh, it's good to be green. Oh, it's good to be socio-economic responsibility all out there. Community program, community engagement. Let's do this. It's a lot of a checkbox mentality. That's what's happening today. But either which way, they're impacting, or there's that outcome-driven path. I'd say some sectors are doing much better than other sectors. So we work across all sectors, from financial services, oil and gas, consumer retail, power and utilities, which sort of overlaps with oil and gas. And I'd say, you and I were chatting about this earlier. As an oil and gas organization, whether you're nat gas, or pipeline company, or a producer, or midstream, upstream, what do you do if your product is carbon, right? That's a big dilemma that nobody has a good answer to, either here in the US or globally. And going back to the Exxon example, great, good story, but how do you affect change, right, at the ground level? When you have 60,000 wells in the Permian Basin, are you going to measure all 60,000? Are you going to deploy drone technology to understand fugitive emissions? It's not there yet, right? There's two parts to that again. I think one is there's some level of inertia to say we don't even know how much capital is going to be. Is this all going to require? And if we do it, is it even worth it? That level of ROI measurement is going on. We get involved in some of that kind of work. But also the technology is just not there, right? But again, taking an example out of Europe, which has, I would say, cracked the code in many ways than one, especially in the Scandinavia cluster, UK and Ireland market, where, and this is again a publicly available story, where a low orbit satellite picked up a gas leak, a methane leak in a Russian pipeline, which is topical these days. But anyway, and who's operating that satellite? A bank, an investor that's looking at saying, oh my God, now this is liability. So moment you have liability, regulatory, as well as those lofty goals, to me, it's automatic value. As a consumer, I stand to gain if one of those things opens up level of transparency and exposure that somebody's got to go have to address.
So what I'm definitely hearing is there's a lot of different lenses.
Yes.
Whether it's from the investor lens, managing risk, managing sustainability of future value.
Yeah.
You've got reputational issues. You've
Yeah.
got business needs, all of which is going to be supported somehow by innovation that will promote transparency, promote some settling and consistency of standards and
Sure.
governance and monitoring of these issues. The last point I want to touch on is the individual. So all these companies, tens of thousands of employees, the war for talent is as strong as ever in any sector. And a lot of them are driven by their own individual purpose. And how do you align that with corporate purpose, with the regulatory environment? And is there a role for innovation to play there?
So I think there's no bad ideas as for everything, right? What we're finding is, again, that level of activism inside a corporation is driving the corporate agenda, not the other way, right? And so most corporations are saying, oh, we're going to be, net zero, or we're going to focus on better socioeconomic and equity programs by 2025, 2030. Even we have a 2025 goal and a 2030 goal as a firm in the US. But when it comes to individual contribution, I think it's the other way. I keep coming back to that because what we're learning is that at the board level, at the C-suite level, it's fine to have a nice PowerPoint presentation, but it falls flat when your employees don't believe in it, right? And as we and out of the workforce of the future, the millennials and the Gen Zs, as they come into the workforce, their sense of purpose is very, very, very different. Yes, they all watch YouTube, want to be a YouTuber, or streaming gaming online, but they also have that sense of purpose that identifies saying, I'm going to be more green, and I'm not buying a Tesla because I want to be green when I drive. I'm buying a Tesla because I'm actually powering it with solar power on my roof, so it's actually absolutely green. People are actually understanding what that means, right? Because about 2 years ago, even before the pandemic, buying a Tesla, and just a good example, I guess, was cool because I'm green. Look at this, I'm driving an electric car. But you're charging that with fossil fuels, right? And that was lost on a lot of people. And as the pandemic sort of came around, it's like, oh, hold on a minute. Tesla and other companies that claim to be green are actually producing more carbon. And this is a known fact that EV companies make more money selling carbon credits than they make by selling cars. So then how do you bridge that gap? And that's where the individual activism and the individual interest has come about in automation, innovation. And when I say innovation, again, it's to look at that value chain from procurement to actually making finished goods to supplying distribution, going back to my peach and pear example. And then national security interests are bringing everything closer, which is somewhat needed. So we're headed to a hybrid model where individuals are contributing to that level of thinking, but then also back to Momentum Capital. I was fortunate enough to be at COP26, and you could see Momentum Capital saying, we're not waiting for government or policymakers or regulators to understand. We're just going to go do it, right? And force it in a way that it recognizes individual contribution, but also recognizes doing things right and getting things right.
Great. So last words to you. What would be your call to action to all of the above? We've covered a lot of ground in terms of the different layers of stakeholders, but if you had an audience in front of you and you wanted them to focus on a couple of key items that will support this sustainability agenda, what would it be?
So in typical consulting fashion, I'll give you a 3-part framework. So I call them the 3 S's of how quickly to move things: soil, seed, sunshine, right? You need all 3, whether it's soil for carbon sequestration, seed for reforestation, sunshine for solar and everything else. That is very, very lost on a lot of people in understanding, not just the framework, but what do we need to do to move the needle? There is not enough programs in place where organizations can come through and understand. But to your point about innovation, there's amazing stuff going on in New York City with community solar projects that even though you as in me or anybody else that doesn't have access to green energy can actually participate in community solar programs. So again, it's that sunshine, right? And then in Brazil, one of the programs we're very excited as a firm to be participating in, not to plug KPMG, but is we're working with individual farmers in Brazil around the rainforest. So basically sequestering and protecting the world's largest green jewel, and incentivizing them not to cultivate soil, right? And so if you incentivize farmers and other participants in the so-called sort of global supply chain of economics, we won already. But how do you make it a better story, sustainable story, and industrial story, right? And so those are the three things I would leave you with, and everybody here.
Thank you. Well, that excellent framing, that call to action, and also just that kind of ambition that if we create those incentives,
Correct.
it will change behaviors over time. And we heard that from a number of speakers here today. Arun, great pleasure. Thank you for your comments.
Thank you.
And thank you to Ideagen for facilitating us today.
Thank you.